Tired of reading? Let the lazy husky do the work. We've got the best web novel audiobooks right here. Make sure to subscribe.
Chapter 69, Your Fault, 1. Meanwhile, a half a mile from their direction, beyond that hill, the conflict between the two forces was still ongoing. On the Hawk Academy's side, the adults had taken the front line, trying their damnedest to block any of these black-clothed men from passing through a barrier they had set up around the about 20 students. The adults themselves were only around 10, a mixture of teachers and a few guards to keep the students protected. Most were all at the late stage inner haven rank, while some were even at the spirit rank. Yet so were their foe, and there were around 20 of them. They were outnumbered, but they fought on with all their might to protect themselves and the students. But being only so few against so many. Eventually one of the teachers, a rather buff male, was struck by a wild bolt of an electric spell, stunning him to the ground. This opened room in their defensive line, allowing two of the black-clothed men through to their horror. Unable to react in time, the two black-clothed men both revealed glowing gems in their hands that, when touching the erected barrier around the students, shattered it immediately on impact. The screams of the various students rang out, and outside the barrier, all of the adults increased their aggressiveness in an attempt to throw off their attackers so that they could rush off to help the students. But they were finding no luck. These attackers were like leeches as they maliciously stuck close to them, only attempting to hold them at bay. It was clear that the students were their target. Inside the barrier, while most of the students were shaking in fear, 3 students in particular were standing protectively at the front. If Andrea and Lexa were to see them, they would recognize them as the good Farhawk, Seth. The shaking and anxious, Jared Lolan. And finally, the cool girl, Sandra Button. Stop. If you dare to attack a Hawk Academy student, we will hunt you down, a teacher outside growled viciously as he held back another attack from one of the black-clothed men. The teacher looked on with a pained expression as another teacher beside him was struck with a large cut across her arm, and his anger grew further. Hey, that's if you can find us afterwards. One of the 2 men who had entered the barrier sneered as he walked towards the students at his leisure, the other walking in close step. Stand back, I've got this. Seth Farhawk breathed out heavily, seemingly preparing himself. Idiot, you can't do anything. None of us can at our levels. Jared cried out as he reached out his hand to grasp him, but was too late as Seth was already sprinting forward, one hand behind his back. Jared and Sandra could see a blade concealed in those hands. Against this small child, the black-clothed man sneered once more as he sent an aura-enforced punch leisurely in Seph's direction, only to find the boy swinging a blade out in the last second to meet his fist. Still, he only sneered further. How could the attack of a Foundation-ranked magician hurt him who was at the early stage of spirit rank? But shockingly, the blade actually began to dig into his fingers, splashing blood into the air. How? The black-clothed man's eyes went wide in shock before he clenched his teeth and let out a nasty growl. This blade is the strongest weapon my father left for me and can break most any weapon. Seth Farhawk continued to dig the blade into the man's fingers, only to find the other black-clothed man sending a torrent of wind in his direction in the shape of a thick spear. Reacting quickly, he pressed his right foot down and casted a spell that erected a thick earth wall before disengaging with the other black-clothed man, quickly moving in retreat. But to his shock, in his retreat, he saw that the spear-shaped wind didn't even bother striking the earthen wall, which would have slowed it down for a second, but actually swerved around it in a natural curve before shooting into his shoulder at the speed of a crossbow. Seth let out a pained cry as he tumbled on the ground. Watching on, Jared and Sandra cried out as well. On the floor, Seth let out a mouthful of blood as he struggled to get up, only to fail. To think the distance between ranks is so much. That one spell didn't just pierce me, but tore up my insides as well. Seth could only hold back the pained cry that threatened to release from his parched lips. Rather impressive brat. But, more foolish than anything. The black-clothed man let out a sinister laugh as he shook his blooded hand, droplets of blood scattering into the air and onto the ground. Enough, let's stay on objective. The other man spoke lazily before walking forth once more, and Seth could only curse himself as he watched the 2 men do so from his prone position. Jared and Sandra looked in each other's eyes, seeing a determined gleam in them before they turned to look at the 2 encroaching men. They sang out long chants that the two incoming men didn't even bother interrupting. They didn't put these kids in their eyes. While a thick, metallic glove formed around Jared's fists, a fiery shape erupted from behind Sandra, taking on the shape of a bird made out of pure magma. She had chosen to use the volcanic eagle spell right off the bat. She couldn't afford not to. Outside the barrier, several of the teachers and the guards had been restrained, held roughly on the ground and watching on helplessly as these two men threatened down on the children they had worked so hard to protect. Their eyes held despair and guilt while the black-clothed men above them let out sinister laughs and looked on expectantly. Without any warning, the volcanic eagle and Jared charged forth in conjunction. Faced with these two attacks, the two men's smiles didn't fade for even a second. Chapter 70, Your Fault, 2. I have to admit, your inheritance from the volcanic eagle is quite impressive, but... The man grinned maliciously before a bear-like shape erupted from the man's chest, all without the need for chanting a spell. This bear-like beast shined in a crimson-brown color and was translucent. It's his spirit avatar. Sandra clenched her teeth. The spirit avatar was the signature feature of the spirit rank. Following foot with the other black-clothed man, a ghastly shape erupted from the other man. This one glowed in a menacing grayish-black color and took on the shape of some sort of ghostly figure that seemed fluid in its shape. Against a foe that was two whole ranks above them, no matter how spectacular of a spell they attacked with, Sandra and Jared were doomed to fail. And so when the first spirit avatar, the one resembling some sort of bear, clashed with Sandra's volcanic eagle, the two stood at a standstill for several moments before the spirit avatar burst through, throwing magma scattering. Sandra looked on in horror as this happened. Though she had wholly expected this, it still pained her as it seemed to paint the hopelessness she was feeling in a true light. Things didn't improve when she saw in her periphery the scene of the ghastly spirit avatar of the other black-clothed man whirling around Jared, dealing several nasty cuts before flinging him roughly into a nearby boulder which busted into debris and smoke. The students cried out behind them, also losing all hope. The black-clothed man who had clashed with Sandra recalled his spirit avatar, the form of the bear receding into his chest area. With daunting steps his frame got closer and closer to Sandra, who was so tense her legs couldn't even shake in her fear. Yet, she had never been one to take a threat lying down. She would fight to the bitter end. Without hesitation she leapt forth, all the while chanting a spell that formed magma that extended from her right fist, coating it in a demonic-looking form. She swung this demonic magma fist in an arc towards the black-clothed man, only for it to be blocked effortlessly by a translucent barrier. Her hand could only dig in a cm in this thick barrier. The worst part was that this barrier suddenly extended, entrapping her arm and forcing her there. She had no escape. Ha ha ha, you should have ran while you had a chance. The black-clothed man laughed sinisterly as the dark frame of his hand came inching closer towards her. Despite being just a normal hand, she couldn't hold back the thought that this hand looked more demonic than the one on her right hand right at this moment. Like you'd let any of us run. Sandra smiled bitterly internally. Clench. Sandra let out a hoarse, pained voice as she was grabbed roughly by the throat, all before being lifted and then sent crashing into the earthly ground below. Gwa. Sandra cried out in pain, tears threatening to pour from her hazy eyes. She was only a 10-year-old in the end, and her emotions weren't as easy as control as she would like. With a sinister laugh, the black-clothed man seemed to take enjoyment in her pain as he leaned down to her ear, a grin showing through the minute gap in his black get-up. This is your fault, you know. If only you had played your part properly, none of you would have had to suffer like this. The man's croaky voice sounded in her ears, causing an electric shock of realization to run through her, a look of despair darkening her features afterwards. The black-clothed man simply laughed more maniacally at the sight, licking his lips playfully. Sandra's despair was interrupted by the sound of several squeals and pained cries behind her. Lifting herself enough to see, she saw the further despairing sight of all the students being held down by several vines, all covered in spikes that dug into the children's flesh. This horrific spell was seemingly created by the other black-clothed man. Don't worry, only a few of you will suffer. The ones who have angered the wrong person. The black-clothed man continued, his voice sounding gleeful. A deep contrast to the feeling of despair coursing through Sandra at this moment. The black-clothed man's voice didn't stop there as his sinister voice continued in her ear. Also, it'll just be a few scars. Just a few. Meanwhile, the erected barrier that was created to protect the students was fully dissipated as some of the other black-clothed men from outside began to saunter over, the adults having all been held down at this time as well. Sandra closed her eyes and hiccuped. The tears had begun to fall against her will. When they opened again, they saw the sight of the black-clothed man who was hovering over her, raising a sharp metallic knife. It was going to descend upon her, digging into her flesh. Despite this, she looked at this sight numbly. She was not going to give them the pleasure of hearing her scream. It was at this moment, when things seemed gloomiest, that the contrasting sound of a young girl's voice spread throughout the area, arriving in the ears of every single one of them, speaking words that suited more an elderly person than that of a young girl. "What a bunch of black-bellied bullies. Leave those kids alone, you bunch of oversized brat." Chapter 71, Saving the Day. Everyone in the area looked towards the apex of a nearby hill in shock, especially those men dressed all in black. They didn't dare to look down on the arrival of this small girl, for behind her was a man whose presence brought off a sense of utter dread in them. While they couldn't tell his level, the disparity being so too large, they could tell it was higher than all of theirs. That meant that this man had broke through to the sky realm. Magicians at the earth rank like them didn't dare to even look at someone of his realm wrongly, let alone face off against them. Even at their numbers. Instantly, the assumed leader of the bunch, a man at the middle stage spirit rank, pulled out a rather ancient-looking scroll. On its aged form, various runes surrounded its frame and a dull azure glow immediately shone once it was unraveled. That dull glow turned bright quickly before the scroll seemed to erupt into ash. The ash took on a marvelous transformation as it turned into several black lines that arranged itself into a large flat circle in the air, quickly forming into the familiar shape of a void portal with its eternal darkness center and azure glowing rim that whisked off into a smoky texture as it extended from the portal. Without delay, that man leapt into the portal, vanishing into its deep darkness. Following his lead, several of the others began to retreat into the portal as well. However, before most of the could all vanish, a loud sneer turned the over half of them still as suddenly they felt a deep coldness and they began to freeze from the feet up. Eventually, more than 10 men were standing, encased in a thick frost that kept them frozen in place, but breathing. Only, the coldness that they felt prevented them from being functional, only able to chatter their teeth and watch in dismay at what was going to happen to them. Soon after, the portal dissipated, finally leaving them behind with no way out, captured in frost. "Wow, Daddy. You've turned them into popsicles." Andrea laughed and clapped her hands as she unsteadily ran down the hill with a gusto. Lexa looked on in trepidation in her arms as she nearly tripped up several times, ready to act if she were to fall over. Thankfully, Andrea reached the bottom with steady steps and worked her way towards the students, teachers, and guards of Hawk Academy. Behind her, Alexander Wilderwolf and a few Wilderwolf soldiers followed behind at a leisurely but guarded pace. The carriage and a few soldiers were left behind as the carriage would have trouble traversing such uneven and steep terrain. "Hello, cool girl, brooding boy, and Sir Shaky Butt. I am Andrea and this is my tamed beast, Lexa." Andrea introduced herself in bright spirits, even remembering to introduce Lexa too as she held her loftily above her head. Lexa simply laid dangling from her hands, letting out a helpless sigh. Meow tilde Lexa decided to give her usual greeting. All of them looked at the scene in front of them with an incredulous expression, their faces as if saying that's a magical beast. Isn't it just a normal house cat? Why do I feel like I'll be seeing this sort of reaction a lot in the future? Lexa muttered with a wry smile as Andrea returned her to her usual spot in her bosom. Why are you the left hand of the king and queen? Head of the Wilderwolf family, Alexander Wilderwolf. One of the Hawk Academy teachers limped forward. While they had escaped the brunt of the tragedy, many of them still held wounds of various intensities. Only the majority of the students made it out unscathed, physically at least. Indeed. Alexander answered as he reached the gathering. His eyes narrowed as he surveyed the several wounded folks in front of him and he let out a deep sigh. At least there didn't seem to be anyone in a life or death situation. Anyone with any medical training, go and help as much as you can. Especially those 3 children. Damage dealt by magic above your level can't be light on them. Yes, sir. About 5 out of the 15 or so Wilderwolf soldiers answered with stoic voices before bounding forward with determination. I don't know how to thank you. The same teacher from before bowed deeply with reddening eyes. Following his lead, the other teachers and guards bowed as well. They still felt incredibly guilty at being unable to protect their students' employees. I just did what I should. No dash. Suddenly, Alexander ceased talking and his head whipped to the several frozen black-clothed men as he shouted loudly in exclamation, bringing everyone's attention thereto. To their utter shock, they found that blood was leaking out of every orifice in the heads of the captured men in black. Each of their eyes had turned dull and grey as well, lifeless as they stared dully forward. They actually had some sort of spell embedded in them. A guard exhaled. It would seem so. Another teacher sighed disappointingly. The ones that escaped must have had it activated so that they don't talk. This is my fault. I actually underestimated this group. I had thought they would be unable to do anything under my shimmering frost spell that freezes up the body entirely, allowing for hardly even the slightest of moments while also keeping them breathing and alive. Looks like this group isn't just some simple bandits. Alexander muttered darkly. Let's see if I make the same mistake if I see you lot again. Meanwhile, Andrea had noticed from the corner of her eye a dazed look on Sandra, who was sitting on the ground, her wounds already healed with a healing-type magic from one of the Wilderwolf soldiers. While her wounds were not small, they had mostly been dealt with. Walking up to her, Sandra was suddenly surprised by the magnified view of a cute young girl's face just inches from her own, causing her to gasp and accidentally knock heads with her. Oh. Why hit and IRA? Andrea hopped in a circle as she pressed a free hand on her bruising forehead, a pout forming on her lips. In her arms, Lexa let out a bellowing and cheerful laugh, causing her to pout more. Sorry. Sandra apologized as she shook her head. Knocking her head seemed to awaken her from her dazed state somewhat, but she still seemed to portray a solemn mood. That's okay, Andrea's strong. Andrea posed one of her arms in the show of her muscles. Only, her arms were too skinny and fair to look anything but the arms of a doll. Sandra finally let out a giggle at Andrea's mucking around and the color seemed to gradually return to her eyes before she let out a defeated sigh once more. In Andrea's arms, Lexa thought on what could be going through this girl's head that has got her so sullen. Well, more so than the others who suffered the ambush. Take the 2 other students who were injured, Seth and Jared for example. Seth is silent and holds a solemn air, but even more so there is a strong determination in his eyes while he reassures a shaking Jared while he tries to get over his building nerves. Did this attack have something to do with you? Exclamation point. Sandra flinched visibly and her mood only turned more solemn. Oh, one of the men told me it was my fault. Hey. Andrea tilted her head confused. Why would they attack you? It's that Chris Farhawk fellow, isn't it? Lexa spoke, a growl to her voice as she spoke with narrowed eyes. Sandra simply nodded, giving them her answer. It's all my fault. If I only let him win, no one would have got hurt. Stupid. Andrea stuck her tongue out and stated, somewhat surprising both Lexa and Sandra alike with her bluntness. You can't give in. Her words might not be all that elegant, but she's not wrong. Lexa agreed. But Sandra was about to fight back when Seth and Jared suddenly joined in on the conversation as they walked into their small circle. They're right. Seth spoke in his usual cold voice, however there was a warmth in his eyes as he placed an arm on Sandra's shoulder in a comforting gesture. Yeah, we may not have any proof to go against that little brat, but that doesn't prevent us from giving him hell. Jared managed to put on a big grin and stop shaking for a few seconds to look rather heroic as he joined Seth in placing a hand on Sandra's other shoulder. Yeah, kick his bottom in. Andrea cheered, stretching on her tiptoes so she can pat Sandra on the head. Though even then, she was still a little short of reaching her goal and could only pat the air awkwardly. Thank. Why you? Sandra held back her tears as she brushed them dry before replacing her look of angst with one of determination. She was usually a strong-willed little girl, and it didn't take long for her to realize that acting all somber wouldn't help her. Though it was impossible for someone so young to put the event past her so quickly, and she still held some lingering fear as she spoke shakily, yet determinedly. "I'll definitely kick his ass. That's the spirit. Haha." Lexa laughed. "Andrea dealt with him once, so call Andrea over to help when you do." Andrea seemed more than enthusiastic at the prospect of beating up Chris Farhawk, and Lexa couldn't help but agree. She wouldn't mind throwing in a few bites and slashes of her claws as well. As the children's tense mood turned warm with laughter, Alexander looked on warmly for a few seconds before getting to work, using his limited medical knowledge to help a few of the injured as well. In the end, for the Hawk Academy's students' and staff's protection, the two sides mutually agreed to travel together towards Falcon City. Andrea was joyful when she heard this and advocated for Sandra, Jared, and Seth joining them in the carriage, which Alexander agreed to after some convincing. He was never good at refusing requests from this youngest daughter of his. Especially when she gave him one of those cute puppy eyes of hers. And so, after about an hour of settling various tasks, the Wilderwolf party was joined by the students, teachers, and guards from Hawk Academy as they continued on their trail to Falcon City. It took a while for all of the people from Hawk Academy to cool down after such a daunting experience, but eventually, the sound of merry talking could be heard as teacher and guards talked to some of the Wilderwolf soldiers, and the around 20 students began talking among themselves. The palpable fear that had brewed since the ambush gradually vanished with the passage of time. Though at the same time, the experience and fear they felt at that time would never truly be gone from their thoughts so soon. All the while, hidden eyes were watching their every move intently, a sinister gleam hidden within. Chapter 72, Thistle Forest. With the added members of Hawk Academy, the Wilderwolf party returned to the path towards Falcon City. Inside, the constant chatter of the children could be heard. Well, the constant chattering of Andrea could be heard mostly, as Sandra, Jared and Seth mostly listened as she rambled on, only putting in a word every now and then. Despite her chatty and bratty nature, the three couldn't help but hold some warm feeling for the little girl. She was only a 4-year-old after all. Ah, that's right. Andrea seemed to come to a sudden realization. Andrea never got to see the finals. Who won? Oh, I did. Sandra answered, a smile forming her lips. Seth added in a nod of agreement. His emotions couldn't be seen in his, as usual, cold expression. Whoa, I knew you were cool. Andrea clapped her hands, disturbing Lexa's rest as she was lying on her thighs. Andrea looked down at her with a wry smile. Sorry. Don't worry, I had long given up sleeping with your constant bickering. Lexa didn't bother with her retaliation as she turned to Sandra and spoke. So you won in the end. I thought as much. Why's that? Jared chirped in and asked with narrowed, accusing eyes. Are you saying Seth is weak? Seth stayed silent. Keep a hold of yourself, lover boy. I'm just saying that Seth didn't show me any magic that could hold a candle to Sandra's volcanic eagle spell. Lexa quipped, enjoying the reaction it got out of Jared, who instantly turned red in the face and began shaking anxiously. IIT's not Lee Jared stammered, his eyes darting left and right as his brain worked like a cog, thinking of the right response. You're right, I couldn't find a way past her volcanic eagle magic. Seth finally spoke, interrupting Jared halfway through his blubberings. Lexa looked at Seth with knowing eyes. Saving Jared some face, huh? Seth avoided her searching eyes. Hee. I was really lucky when I stumbled upon such a great inheritance. Sandra sighed with a smile. It's really pushed my magic forward, and my cultivation. Without it, my victory over Seth wouldn't be so certain. Wait, it helps your cultivation as well? Did you got a cultivation technique as well? Jared asked, his mouth hanging wide open in shock. Even Seth held his eyes wide for a second upon hearing this. Sandra hummed positively, adding on to Jared's shock. Seth just let out a defeated sigh. What is a CQLI? Andrea stumbled. What's a cultivation technique? Lexa asked at the same time, her words overlapping with Andrea's. What she said. Andrea smiled cheerfully and giggled as she ruffled Lexa's fur, to the little kitten's annoyance. We're like twins. Let's see, how to explain it. Sandra placed her fingers on her chin and thought about the best words to explain it. She wasn't used to being the teacher, always being the student, so she had some trouble coming up with the right words. Eventually, she turned to face Jared and Seth, but gave up immediately when faced with one shaking his head anxiously and the other looking out the carriage window silently. Haha, I can answer this one. Alexander spoke up at this point and explained. A cultivation technique is simply a method one can use while cultivating to enhance the process, speeding up one's cultivation. Our wilder wolf family has quite a few as well. None that was left behind by one of the 5 legendary beasts though. That's quite the precious item you found there, little Sandra. Sandra responded a little shyly. She couldn't help the smile on her face. It wasn't every day you were praised by a magician at the Sky Realm after all, especially one who held such a grand position as Alexander Wilderwolf. A cultivation technique. I definitely want to read one of those when I have the ability to. Lexa thought. The carriage continued on for several hours with the sound of cheerful conversation until eventually, one could see the darkening of the world outside the carriage and the rising of the silver moon. It was not recommended to travel at night due to the dangers involved, and despite the serious firepower of the Wilderwolf soldiers led by Alexander, they chose to settle down for the night as well. If only to let the young students have a rest from the long day's travel, especially after the incident earlier in the day. Several of the children were still holding on to lingering fears that night, and several of the teachers had to lull them to sleep. The next morning, after a nice morning breakfast, it was decided that they would rest a little longer and leave at evening to allow some of the students some extra rest, as several of them had found it difficult to sleep a full night's rest the night before. Eventually, about the time the sun was reaching its apex in the sky, everyone was ready to set off after a small dinner. On the road again, it only took 2 hours before the endless plains of the northern hills came to an end and they found themselves in front of a large span of forest that extended from Falsio's western region and into the northern region. Falcon City was only a day's journey from the other side of this forest and lied on the intersection of 3 out of the 4 regions that make up Falsio. These 3 regions are the northern region, eastern region, and western region. Where these borders meet, split up Falcon City into 3 districts, known as the North District, East District, and West District respectively. These 3 districts are also known by other names as well, however. The West District is also known as the Commoners Districts, the East District as the Magicians District, and the North District as the Nobles District. The Wilder Wolf estate lied in the Northern Nobles District. When Lexa laid eyes on the forest in front of her, she couldn't help but drop her feline jaw in awe. This wasn't a normal forest, none like she had seen before anyway. It's amazing, right? Andrea laughed happily, holding herself and the kitten as they leaned out of the window. Andrea saw it when going to the north. It's so pretty. Lexa absent-mindedly nodded, her eyes not leaving the forest ahead of them. In fact, she wondered if it was appropriate to call it a forest at all, when the things in front of her were clearly not trees and more like large, expansive flowers that reached high into the sky. These flowers had a purple top with several jutting spikes, beneath that were prickly leaves that extended and intertwined with the leaves of the other flowers of its kind. And then on its long and thick stem, further spikes could be seen. Despite the dangerous-looking nature of it all, it still held a look of beauty as they let out slight azure glow every now and then, hinting to their magical nature. This was the first really magical location Lexa has seen in this world, and it blew her away with its natural beauty and grandeur. Those trees actually hold magical properties and are cut down to create several magical items. This forest used to be a lot larger. Seth stated with a dry voice, his cheek leaning on the palm of his hand, the elbow of which was also leaning on the carriage's window ledge. Lexa felt like she had been slapped in the face. Here I was marveling at the beauty of nature and you go and say such a horrid thing. Seth didn't bother with the kitten's glare and continued looking out the window absent-mindedly. Don't worry. A previous monarch started the initiative that for every one of these trees we cut down, another would be planted. Sandra chipped in cheerily, happy to speak on something she knew about. What are those trees? I've never seen anything like them. Are they flowers? Lexa asked. Indeed. They are a flower called the rising earth thistle, a type of magical flower that start as small flowers but quickly grow in length to the size of large trees. Jared explained, letting out a pleasant reminiscent sigh. My mummy grew one in her back garden once. Once. What happened to it? Sandra asked quizzically. Well, it grew wrong and bent into the neighbor's garden. And collapsed on their pet. Jared pouted. We had to cut it down and pay for the pet's medical fees. The story got a laugh out of the children and the kitten, much to Jared's embarrassment. All the while, their carriage was gaining on the forest and Lexa noticed that she still didn't know what this place was called and asked to no one in particular. So what is this forest called? Oh, I know. Andrea chirped. It's called Thistle Forest. Unbeknown to them as they entered the shade of Thistle Forest, a figure watched with a dark gaze, his sight never leaving them until they disappeared into the darkness of the forest's shade. This is the perfect place to act. A sinister gleam passed the eyes of the shady figure called Sava. That item our client gave us will work perfectly in this forest. Chapter 73, Ghostwalker Medallion, 1. Lexa let out a satisfied yawn as she laid in the lap of Andrea, who petted her soft glistening silver fur at her leisure. The two were sat beside a lit fireplace that radiated a comforting warmth in the coldness of the night. Their group had spent several hours trekking through Thistle Forest until dusk, and thanks to the low level of danger present in the forest, the group had managed to journey a good distance during that time. They should be able to depart from Thistle Forest in around 2 days' time. Now, everyone was chattering and playing little games to pass the night away. Some tired children had already headed to the tents, gaining lost sleep. Andrea spent the rest of the night chatting with Sandra, Jared, and Seth until finally her tiredness seemed to take over her and her voice became less and less lively, her eyes beginning to droop. Despite her body calling for her to sleep, Andrea wanted to stay up longer to talk to her new friends and fought with her whole strength to stay awake. Eventually, she could hardly hold on any longer and Alexander walked over, picking her up in his sturdy arms as he cooed. Come on little un, I think it's time to call it a night, No Tilda. Andrea's half-asleep state instantly melted and her face became lively again, only it turned into an unhappy frown as she whined. Andrea wants to talk to Andrea's friends longer. Hearing her whines, Sandra and Jared could only look at Alexander with wry expressions. Seth all the while holding a cold facade as always. That's okay little un, they'll be heading off to their beds as well. Right. Alexander smiled at Andrea's direction, but directed the latter part to the 3 9-year-olds across from himself. Andrea turned to look at her 3 new friends in a begging pout. But at the same time behind her, Alexander who was holding her was looking at them with an expression that told them that if they didn't comply with his words, then, with a gulp, 2 of them furiously supported Alexander under his cold gaze. I was just thinking how tired I was and was going to say goodnight any second now. Sandra blurted. Why yeah, me too. Actually, I've been meaning to go to bed for about an hour now. In fact, how about I just go now? Jared stuttered as he started to walk backwards. His feet were shaking under the gaze that seemed to freeze him to the core in fear. He could only imagine what punishment he would dish out if they didn't play along with him. In opposition to the other 2's immediate compliance, Seth looked to be about to argue otherwise as his mouth opened to protest. That was until he felt a painful pinch at the side of his waist halting his words. Turning to see the cause, he saw a shaking Jared shaking his head furiously before he pulled him away by his collar as they off to their tents to sleep. Looking at the 2 boys leaving in such a hurry, Sandra didn't pause to follow them in haste as well. She didn't forget to say a shaky goodnight to Andrea though. See, they're going to their bed as well. Alexander gave Andrea his brightest smile, as if he had not just had the appearance of a demon just seconds before. In Andrea's arms, Lexa couldn't help the shiver that traveled down her spine at the display. Truly a frightening display of switching personalities on a dime. Okay. Andrea finally relented. Her eyes were already closed as she leaned her blonde head on her father's comforting shoulder. Alexander's fake smile turned real as he petted her hair soothingly as he walked over to the tent designated as hers and the kitten's. Lexa leapt out of Andrea's weakening arms as she drifted to sleep and followed Alexander as he placed Andrea into the tent, tugging her into a thick pink sleeping bag that would keep her well warmed in the cold night. Alexander watched as Lexa leapt up on the sleeping bag and circled a spot before bundling up as she prepared to go to sleep as well. With a final kiss to his daughter's cheek and a rub of the kitten's cheek, Alexander left the tent contented and feeling warm. His figure disappeared from the tent with a final goodbye. "Good night, little un. Lexa." Those words and the sleeping bag beneath her warmed Lexa as she finally drifted from consciousness. Elsewhere in Thistle Forest, a few miles from the encampment of the Wilderwolf family and Hawk Academy, was a large, but dilapidated building. It was a 2-story building of intricate design, but it had clearly been untouched for several decades, if not centuries. Throughout the whole building were several shady and rough-looking figures walking to and fro or standing around in groups, chattering in husky, croaky voices. On the outside were wooden stairs that led up to the house's large, double doors. On these stairs, even more people were sitting and standing about at their leisure. Most strikingly was the figure sitting on the topmost step of those stairs, sitting dead in the center as if those decrepit stairs were his throne. This man was the familiar beast-eyed killer, with his trademark jagged eyes that held a dangerous and dark gleam, as well as the scar that crossed the bridge of his nose. Chapter 74, Ghost Walker Medallion, 2. At this moment, the beast-eyed killer was looking off into the distance, into the darkness of the thistle forest in front of him. That was until he turned to look at a certain figure who stood at his side. This figure was an extremely tall man, even more so than the beast-eyed killer. But in contrast to the beast-eyed killer's muscular frame, he was rather lanky and thin. He was dressed in a dark blue suit and trousers, and upon his thin head, wore a black bowler hat that seemed to cast his face in a constant, unnatural shadow that shrouded his features. White gloves covered his hands, making it so that there was not a single gap in the man's clothing that showed off his skin. By the man's side was the familiar figure of the man who had initiated the contract with the beast-eyed killer to kidnap Andrea back in Skyview City. His eyes were constantly facing downwards, not daring to look at the figure slightly in front of him for even a second. "I have to say, you have rather shocked me. I hadn't expected you to lend us such a helping hand in this mission. I thought your lot didn't want to get involved in this." The beast-eyed killer spoke, his voice raspy and cold. "To think you not only sent such a powerful rune master such as yourself to create an untraceable barrier around this house, but you actually lent us a pulsing item." "Those were my orders." The lanky man spoke in a gruff voice that held the slightest hints of being modified. The master had learned rumors of the girl's potential. So you first requested this task lightheartedly. But now that your master has gained new info, this little task has become a bigger priority." "I see." The beast-eyed killer's eyes flashed with a mysterious gleam at this information. "Maybe I can try to squeeze out some more from these guys, seeing as it's so important to them. All right then, I have already set up the barrier and your man has been handed the medallion. It is about time I depart." With that, the lanky man pulled out a scroll which he unraveled. Rather similar to the scroll used by those men in black who had attacked the members of Hawk Academy, the scroll turned to ash before forming into a void portal. "We will return tomorrow when the task is done. Fail us, and if they don't kill you, we will." With those vicious words, the lanky man entered the portal, followed shortly after by the man who was continuously standing by his side. In a matter of seconds, the portal had dissipated, leaving only the members of Beast-Eyed Killer's gang behind in the confines of the dilapidated house. TCH. The Beast-Eyed Killer tutted but said nothing else on the matter. It was clear to him that he couldn't offend people who had such rich resources. Plus, the man was long gone anyway. His frustration was swept away, however, by the thought of capturing the little spoiled brat of the Wilderwolf family. He had specifically asked what condition they wanted her in, and the lanky man's response was short but decisive. "Alive, all limbs attached." Gahaha. The beast-eyed killer laughed nastily at this thought. He was a man who knew no better thrill than beating up those rich and proud nobles and watching how their pride fell, and loves to watch as despair slowly overcame them. Children were no exception. Back in the Wilderwolf encampment, a foreign figure walked brazenly past a Wilderwolf soldier, one of the many left on watchguard for the night. This man was the familiar Sava who relished in stealth of thievery. Despite his brazen entrance, the Wilderwolf soldier didn't react any differently than usual, simply standing on watch with a stern expression with a stern gaze. Seeing this, Sava couldn't help the sinister laugh that escaped his mouth. Except, despite his lips moving as such, no sound was actually released, only the natural sounds of the forest could be heard. Sava didn't find this odd, however, as he took hold of a bronze-colored medallion that was currently around his sleek neck in his nimble hands. This Ghostwalker medallion is truly deserving of its grade as a pulsing grade item. Sava marveled at the medallion as he ran his thumb over its ridges. On the medallion was the figure of a swirled, ghoul-like figure that was twisted and haunting in its image and presence. If one looked closely enough, one would also notice that this figure was made out of deeply integrate runes that were minuscule in size, amazingly blending to form the drawing of the ghost-like figure. Dropping the medallion out of his hands so that it lay dangling from his neck, Sava returned his attention to the path set out ahead of him, where he was slowly encroaching on one of the many tents in this encampment. Chapter 75, The Kidnapping. In the darkness of night, Lexa was stirred awake with the feeling of unease. She didn't know why, but something felt wrong. An eerie feeling welling up inside her. But looking around the inside of the tent, she couldn't help but doubt this feeling of unease as her physical senses picked up on no presence in her general vicinity, none that didn't register as friendly anyway. Andrea was still sleeping cutely beneath her, the tips of her fingers peeking out the sleeping bag as she grasped the edge of it and murmured quietly in her sleep. Brushing it off, Lexa was just about to go back to sleep when her eyes suddenly flew wide open and her fur stood on its end as she was suddenly grasped roughly by the back of her neck and thrown maliciously to the side. Her mouth opened wide to let out a pained scream, but to her shock, no sound escaped her lip. Lexa let out a silent cough as she turned to look at the fiend who had thrown her, but looked on with confusion when no figure could be seen where this mysterious attacker should be. She couldn't even feel any foreign aura around her, indicating that there should truly be nothing there. But that was clearly false. Some sort of ghost? Lexa questioned internally with a furrowed brow. This cat is actually a magical beast. Sava's eyes opened wide in surprise. I can actually sense aura emanating from it. It's rather weak, probably a minor magical beast. But it also seems young, so that level is actually rather impressive. Either way, I can't let her go. Killing her would be an absolute waste. Sava walked up to the cat as the beast looked left and right, unable to get even a clue on his bearing. Sava smirked contentedly at this before raising his fist, aura enshrouding it in a blue glow. It let out a blue glow that was still invisible in the eyes of the kitten. But to his surprise, when his punch was about to make contact with the soft flesh of the kitten's upper back, the little magical beast leapt from its spot just in time to dodge the attack. His fist continued forth as it struck the ground explosively, sending shards of earth flying madly, though even still no sound was emitted. Only the earth vibrated with a heavy rumble. How did it sense me? Sava exclaimed internally just as he noticed the flaring of aura to his left side as 4 white lines flew through the air, threatening to strike him in a matter of seconds. Despite his shock and delayed reaction, Sava was still at a level that outclassed the kitten's, and reacting swiftly, struck out with a dagger that was previously strapped to his waist. The dagger was empowered by the element of wind, causing it to be frighteningly sharp and agile as it struck into the side of the attacking spell, threatening down on him and shattering it instantly, the remnants of the spell whizzing off into the air harmlessly before dissipating entirely in a rapid fashion. This guy's powerful. Lexa gritted her teeth and exclaimed internally. She only had one option left against such a powerful foe. Scorching Ray. The bangle on Lexa's tail shone with a blaring red glow, grabbing Sava's attention immediately before it sent off 3 beams of red light shooting at him at an extreme velocity. Sava realized the power of this attack was much more powerful than her previous attack and instantly summoned a thick, deep fog that enveloped his entire body. When the 3 beams struck the black fog, they seemed to vanish in its dark, misty form, and there seemed to be a struggle happening within the fog before 2 of the red beams suddenly struck back out, heading straight at the little kitten. The kitten didn't have a chance against the speed of these beams, only managing to avoid the brunt of one of them whilst another struck her straight in her back leg, piercing through and burning her flesh, digging into it and drawing blood. If her voice wasn't muted, she would have been unable to hold back the shrieking scream that would have escaped her mouth. The pain was excruciating. Lexa's right leg buckled, unable to hold her weight, and she collapsed to the tent's floor beneath. Her eyes were scrunched together as she gritted her teeth and tried to hold back her pain. She couldn't afford to lose herself now. Can't beat him. Need to run. And get Lexa couldn't even finish her thoughts before she was suddenly struck in the head, knocking her into the sea of darkness of unconsciousness. Damn *tch. Sava cried out internally as he held a profusely bleeding wound on the left side of his waist. Crimson blood leaked and dripped through the gaps of his fingers, and no amount of pushing against the wound seemed to stop the bleeding. My damn slithering fog spell could only reflect 2 of the attacks. I can't believe I didn't realize that the third spell was actually 2 spells interlinked with each other, masking it. Sava let out several deep breaths before reaching for a bag that was hanging by his waist, which happened to be a magic pocket. Reaching into it, Sava pulled out a vial with a red liquid swimming inside. Unhesitatingly, he pulled open the lid and downed the liquid. In a matter of seconds, the blood leaking from his waist slowed down, though not entirely. It would seem the potion was not proficient enough to fully heal the extensive damage caused by the Scorchin' Ray spell. It's not enough. I'll need to grab more potions when I return. Thinking along those lines, Sava turned to face the girl, his true target, only to find that she seemed to be stirring awake. With a vicious grin he walked up to her just as she sat up from her lying position, rubbing her eyes as she adjusted to being awakened. She tried to talk but found that her voice didn't come out, and instantly her expression paled when she noticed the mysterious and scary-looking man in her tent. Her shaking eyes then reached the downed and blooded form of Lexa's, and tears began to stream down her pale cheeks. She tried to cry out for her daddy, but her voice would not come out, just adding on to her growing anxiety. She couldn't perform any powerful spells without chanting and could only watch as the man inched closer to her, fear enveloping her. No. I've got to run. Instead of wallowing in fear, Andrea managed to find some strength in her small body. She quickly became determined and her small legs threw her towards the unconscious Lexa, who she picked up in her arms as quickly and cleanly as she could. Lexa felt pained emotionally when she felt a wetness staining her pajamas, knowing that it was the blood flowing from the kitten in her hands. I need to get help quick. Trying to take advantage of her small form, with Lexa in her hands, Andrea attempted to duck from Sava's grasp as she sprinted for the tent's exit. But how could a small child escape the grasp of the agile, more powerful Sava? Andrea felt the back of her neck being grasped roughly, squeezing down on her skin and bruising it badly as it dug into her soft skin. He was unrelenting with his strength. Andrea's fingers and toes clenched as she was dragged off her feet, and Sava held her up by the scruff of her neck, turning her dangling body to face his grinning face. He shook his head and the index finger of his free hand before taking the kitten in his hands as well, holding her haphazardly by the scruff of her neck, just like Andrea. Uncaring for the girl struggling to escape his grasp, Sava walked out of the tent and into the darkness of the forest, no one aware that their beloved young miss was being kidnapped right under their noses. Even Alexander did not notice as he still laid sleeping the night away, his passive senses weakened by his unconsciousness. Andrea cried silently, swinging wildly with her 4 limbs as she attempted to escape this intruder's grasp. But her child body was unable to even scratch the man's skin. Sava just looked at her sneeringly before shoving her downwards, crashing her into the earthly ground below without a care for her well-being. Andrea lost her breath for a moment due to the extreme pain of that blow, and her tears dripped onto the dirt as Sava held her head against it. The pain of his hands crushing her head against the earth was unbearable for her, and she fought to pull his muscular arms off of her. Sava didn't bother anymore and pulled her back up and continued walking, not caring that the girl was still struggling. He didn't want to keep the beast-eyed killer waiting too long, lest he find himself on his bad side. Quickening his steps, Sava dragged his 2 victims in the shade of the night, the light of a crimson moon shining through the dark grey clouds and shrouding the earth below, casting the land in an eerie light. Chapter 76, Despair. In the abandoned building a few miles from the Wilderwolf encampment, the beast-eyed killer continued to sit at the front steps, chin resting in the palm of his right hand. An impatient look can be seen in his impression as his knees bob up and down restlessly. Around him, his followers have refrained from their previous leisurely activities as they now surround the front of the building, leaning on the windows or standing outside on the front porch. In total, there are about 20 of these formidable-looking, vicious thugs. Suddenly, The beast-eyed killer's bobbing leg stops and his jagged eyes narrow in concentration as he looks directly ahead of himself into the distance of the thistle forest. There, he could feel a disturbance in the barrier erected by the mysterious magician of their employers, the lanky fellow who had just left several minutes ago. The beast-eyed killer didn't worry that this was an invader as he recognized that this disturbance was natural to the barrier. A sinister smile forms on his rough features as excitement boils down in him. The mission seems to have been successful. His eyes glow further in the sight of the familiar form of Sava stepping into view, the barrier seemingly opening around his form to let him through. The beast-eyed killer's eyes instantly travel to the fighting girl in the man's hands as she seems to scream and scratch at him, though no sound erupts from her lungs. His pleased, sinister smile grows confused though when he looks at the bundle of fur being carried in Sava's opposite hand, which looks nothing more than a normal house cat. No, it was more accurate to call it a kitten, as it was still very small in size. The only unnatural aspect to this kitten was its glistening silver fur, that seemed much more luxurious than the fur on the average cat. "What's with the kitten, Sava?" the beast-eyed killer questioned with narrowed eyes. "Don't be deceived by its harmless form. This thing is actually a magical beast." Sava responds, just before he wins the hand carrying Lexa back and then swinging that same hand forward, releasing his grip on her, which sends the kitten arcing through the air towards his boss. Lexa awakened to consciousness when she suddenly felt a great pain around her nimble neck and she lets out a series of gruff coughs. Opening her greenish-red eyes, she finds that she is being held by the neck by a man with frightening eyes and a scar that crosses the bridge of his nose. She also notices that she can speak again as her coughs reverberate in her ears clearly, which is both comforting and terrifying. She suddenly feels her body forcefully turned around as the man holding her drags her to directly face him. His jagged eyes seem to study her intently. "Indeed, I can sense aura in it." The beast-eyed killer nods. "But it's just a paltry beast. We'll sell it to some noble brat for a good price." The beast-eyed killer didn't spare the kitten another glance after saying this as he shoved Lexa's dangling form into the hands of his nearest follower, who received her with panicked arms. "Better play dead for now. Need to find a way to save Andrea," Lexa devised internally as she finds herself cradled in the hands of another man, deciding not to put up a fight just yet. "Hand the brat over." The beast-eyed killer finally stands up from his sitting position and takes slow steps down the wooden stairs on his path towards Sava and the girl hanging from his grasp. Andrea, who was still putting up a fight in Sava's hands, finally takes a look at the source of the rough-sounding voice entering her ears and her eyes widen. This man had to be the scariest man she had ever seen, with his tall and muscular stature, his various, gruesome scars and eyes that were like the gaze of a vicious magical beast. Andrea couldn't help her fighting limbs from freezing, only slightly shaking now. The beast-eyes killer was pleased with her frightened reaction and let out a cold, sinister laugh as he continued on his path. Meanwhile, Sava looked at the girl who had been fighting for her life just minutes ago but had frozen like a stone and sneered. Just a little noble brat after all. Without caring for her safety, Sava then threw Andrea, much like he did with Leca. Except this time, his throw wasn't directed at his boss, but to the ground just in front of his boss. Andrea's voice was finally freed from the Ghost Walker medallion's area of effect, releasing in a frantic cry as her body tumbled cruelly on the dirt floor, the solid ground and jutting rocks cutting and bruising her fair skin. A series of laughs broke out from the surrounding followers of the beast-eyed killer as they took pleasure in the girl's pain. The beast-eyed killer's feet came to a stop, as a pleased grin graced his features as well. Lexa closed her hazy eyes and held back her emotions to the best of her small abilities. She felt so useless and various emotions boiled with her: anger, despair, fear. But most prominent was a feeling of guilt. If only I was stronger. If only I had escaped that tent when I could and notified everyone of the intruder. Various thoughts came to her in this chaotic moment, and if she were a human, she would have been unable to stop the painful tears from flowing down her cheeks in droves. With shaking limbs, Andrea attempts to pull her aching body up from the ground, though only manages to get her upper body up as her two legs are too tired to push her up any further. Her breath was coming out in low exhales as she looked with fearful eyes through her blonde bangs at the sight of the terrifying man standing in front of her. She would like nothing else to sprint away from this man, but her aching legs prevent her from doing so. Instead, she can only look on with trepidation as this man looks down at her with his sinister gaze, a playful grin on his lips. It was then that the beastly, frightening man finally moved, his ragged hand reaching down at her like the claws of a great beast. Soon, her view was nearly entirely eclipsed in the darkness of this hand. No. Andrea doesn't want to be hurt. Andrea cried out internally, and now that she was finally free from the silencing of the Ghost Walker medallion, used her ability to speak to rapidly growl out a chant. The Beast Eye Killer did not expect this frozen girl who was shaking like a dog with its tail dangling between its legs to suddenly act so decisively and was completely caught off guard when a sudden gust of wind erupted from her mouth. This gust of wind was sharp and were like hundreds of needles as they dug into his skin. This was less of a calculated spell than a burst of desperation. But in the end, he was a man at the peak of spirit rank and this small spell could only do surface damage, not even lasting a few seconds before his superior natural healing ability recovered all those minuscule wounds. Despite this, the beast-eyed killer became immediately enraged and bellowed out in a growl that shook Andrea to the core. It did nothing. Andrea was truly beginning to feel despair when the beast-eyed killer's ragged and scarred right hand captured her head, his palm squishing against her soft forehead, causing her to screech in pain. Looks like someone needs a lesson. The beast-eyed killer lifted Andrea with his 5 fingers encompassing her small head and made it so he was looking directly into those shaking violet pupils of hers as he spat out his threat. "You're truly in trouble now." Sava laughed joyfully as he walked over to stand amidst other members of the beast-eyed killer's followers, all of whom were also finding enjoyment out of the girl's misery. They were all people who had grown in poverty and held a great hatred for nobility, much like the beast-eyed killer himself. "Don't worry. I'm not going to hurt you." The beast-eyed killer grinned. Andrea was young, but she wasn't naive enough to believe the words of someone like this. Especially considering he had just hurt her. Instead, his words only caused her further grief. "Instead I'm going to take away what you upper-class B** keys treasure the most." The beast-eyed killer spoke directly in her ear when he said this, sending an eerie shiver down her spine that finally broke her as tears began to flow down her cheeks. Her whole face was turning pale in fear. "Your beauty. Let's start with your hair, shall we?" Slice. Before Andrea could even register the man's last words, she suddenly felt her heavy, flowing hair had suddenly turned lighter and she felt a sharp cut run across the back of her neck at the same time. "Oops, I've never been the best barber." The beast-eyed killer chuckled darkly. Andrea looked on in despair as she saw several thin pieces of hair descending like feathers in the air as they landed softly on the ground below. The remnants of her blonde hair mixed in with the drops of blood dripping down her back, a wound she didn't even register in the thick of the moment. With dull eyes, Andrea just kept looking at those pieces of hair as the muted sound of laughs echoed around her. Inside her head, various memories were being played in rapid succession. Chapter 77. Blonde hair and violet eyes. Sometime in the past. In the Wilder Wolf Estate's extensive and elegant garden. "Ah, young miss," Nanny Drew cried out when the vision of a disgruntled Andrea entered her sights. "I leave you for 5 seconds and you end up like this. You are in so much trouble, young lady." It wasn't Andrea's fault. Andrea just wanted to pet the birdie. Andrea pouted as she pointed to a large, white and black feathered bird standing carkily upon a tree branch. Andrea could swear it gave her a snort when she pointed at it and couldn't help but feel even more gloomier. "Andreas didn't expect it to bite me, causing me to fall from the tree." "Ah, come here and let me clean you up." Nanny Drew sighed. After treating her several small wounds and cleaning her of dirt with a little magic, Nanny Drew produced a fancy brush from her magic pocket, which she used to brush Andrea's entangled and messy hair. "You know, you have the most beautiful hair." Nanny Drew smiled warmly, tugging out a knot in the girl's hair, causing her to let out a little whelp of pain. Andrea nodded, though her head's movement was limited. "That's why you have to take good care of yourself. What would your parents say if you suddenly came home with your hair in such a state?" Nanny Drew lectured. "They'd probably fire you." Andrea joked, sticking her tongue out at her nanny. "That's not funny." Nanny Drew tugged on her hair a little harder than necessary, successfully shutting her laughing as she let out another whelp of pain. Nanny Drew smiled victoriously while Andrea pouted. So will you stop being so irresponsible then, Andrea understands. Andrea pouted. But this was probably the 100th time she had been lectured as so. Ah, Daddy loves little Anne's hair so Mutilda Uch. Alexander cooed. Do you know why? Because it's so beautiful. Andrea rolled her eyes. You've said this to Andrea so many times. There's that, but there's also another reason. Alexander said with a warm smile. Huh? Andrea tilted her head cutely and asked. Then what is it, Daddy? It's because it's identical to your mother's. Alexander ran his fingers through her long blonde locks. Just like your beautiful violet eyes that are also like hers. It's like I'm looking at a mini Cindria, but I'm Andrea, not Mummy. Andrea pouted, not having understood her father's words properly. Alexander just laughed and shook her hair with his large, warm hands. You'll understand one day. In the Wilderwolf estate, Andrea was being put to sleep by her mother as she read her one of her favorite books. But by the time the book had been fully read, Andrea's droopy eyes had yet to close as she stubbornly held on to consciousness. Andrea doesn't want to go to bed yet. Andrea complained, her little right hand rubbing against her drooping eye. Cindria, her mother, closed the book and settled it on the desk before turning to her beloved daughter with a kind smile. Leaning over, she brushed the bangs out of her big, doe eyes and spoke softly. How about I tell you a story of how I met your father, then? Oh, Andrea remembers this. Andrea chirped. Mummy fell on him. Hehe, that's right. Cindria chuckled, her violet eyes crescents like the moon above. I was being chased by a bunch of nasty bullies I had caught picking on some poor kids. Being the heroic woman I am, I went to stop them. But I was only young then, and these boys were older and there were quite a few of them. So I only ended up winding them up. Then Mummy ran away and those baddies chased you. Yep. I was running as if my life depended on it, up steep hills and over high buildings. Until eventually, when I was leaping from one building in particular, I smashed straight into your daddy. Cindria laughed at the memory. Daddy said he got mad and tried to capture you too. Andrea remembered her daddy's tale of this story as he had also told her this many times as well. Please, more like he wanted to kill me dead. That was until he was blinded by my beauty. Cindria exaggeratedly swept a hand through her shoulder-length blonde hair, garnering a laugh from her daughter. But seriously, he wanted to find me to compensate him for his suit that I had ruined by making him spill some liquid on it, so he spent days looking for me, with the only clue on me being my blonde hair as he had only seen me from behind as I quickly ran away. It turned out he didn't have to look far as we both went to the same academy. I was rather poor at that time, so instead of paying him back, he requested that I make him lunch every day for dinner. It was only later when I caught on to the fact that this was all so he could hang out with me. Hey. He says that it was my hair that had first attracted him to me, those and my violet eyes. Yeah, Daddy says he thought you were Angel. And now, you have also inherited my blonde hair and violet eyes. You truly are our little angel. Cindria placed her forehead against her daughter and smiled into her violet eyes that were much like hers and brushed her fingers across the hair that was much like her own as well. But Andrea doesn't want to be an angel. Andrea pouted. Oh, what does our little Anne want to be then? Cindria laughed sweetly. Andrea wants to be a great magician like Lexa, the shooting star. Andrea pumped her little fist. Andrea wants to be strong. Then Andrea can protect Mummy and Daddy, like how you protect Andrea. That's a great dream. Cindria kissed Andrea's forehead and caressed her rosy cheek as she finally drifted off to a peaceful sleep. Our little angel. Andrea's arms and legs turned limp and her pupils turned hollow as her eyes constantly gazed downwards at her shaven hair as her fear completely overtook her, leaving only hollowness and a deeply rooted despair. Now, what should I cut up next? The beast-eyed killer licked his lips and toyed with the blade in his hand as he spoke amidst his laughter. Chapter 78, Desperation. Lexa felt her breath get caught in her throat as she looked into the dull eyes of Andrea, her previous fight driven out of her as she laid frozen in the arms of the leader of this group of thugs. Amidst the turmoil inside her, more prominent was the boiling feeling of anger that began to consume her. How dare he hurt her? Lexa's sharp teeth clenched and the whites of her eyes became bloodshot as an animalistic look overtook her usually cute features. Gahahaha, such a little brat. Is this all it takes to break you down? The beast-eyed killer laughed viciously, his menacing eyes inches from Andrea's violet ones. His eyes looked into those dull eyes and saw them begin to well up with tears, and a look of fear overtook her. The reaction pleased him and fed his desire for more. Drop. Gah. Andrea yelped as she suddenly felt herself being let go, gravity slamming her into the hard ground below. The pain only caused more tears to flow. She felt a bundle of her hair on the floor and her little hands clenched around it. I've had my fun for now. You want a shot, Sava? The beast-eyed killer turned to the person in question as he asked this, a playful and sinister grin adorning his face. Gladly, boss. Sava didn't waste time as he sauntered forward, his larger form coming to shadow over the little girl as she looked on, frightened to the core as she shook her head more and started mouthing the same word repeatedly. But no sound escaped her lips, not because of the Ghost Walker medallion but due to her own throat squeezing up in her panic. While danger was looming over Andrea, a sudden and explosive surge of aura drew the attention away from the girl and towards the source. Everyone looked on in shock to find that this large source of aura was originating from the small, beaten-up kitten. Most shocked was the thug that had been carrying her, not because of her exploding aura. No, it was because seconds before she entered that state, the kitten had sprung to life in his hands and had struck him with her claws, cleaving a large chunk from his jaw to his right eye, sending him into a fate of pain so powerful he was left rolling on the floor while crying bloody murder. This can't be. Sava's eyes were wide open as he witnessed the scene in front of him. She's trying to force a breakthrough. The beast-eyed killer quirked an eyebrow, a seemingly amused smile graced his lips. Compared to everyone else's shocked reaction, his reaction seemed rather unperturbed by the situation. Currently, in Lexa's body, a great surge of aura was erupting from her inner haven as it was being forcefully sucked out at its quickest pace and rapidly absorbed by her soul, which was pulsing from the strain as it rapidly got smaller and smaller the closer the kitten breached her breakthrough. Lexa's sharp and bloody claws dug into the earth and her lithe muscles pulsed with every fit of pain brought by practicing such a method to forcefully evolve her soul. Should I stop her? Sava asked, a malicious glint to his eyes. He had calmed from his initial shock when he realized that even if this kitten broke through to the next level, in the end, she would only be at the early stage of major rank while he was at the early stage of inner haven rank, not to mention his boss, who was at the late stage of spirit rank. This kitten was no threat and her show of fighting back simply irritated him, making him want to deal her some punishment. What better method than to interrupt her during a breakthrough? Don't bother, she'd lose all her worth if something bad happened. And I'm quite interested to see what this breakthrough brings. There are many beasts who go through quite the transformation between certain ranks. Perhaps she is the same. The beast-eyed killer pondered with a relaxed grin. That's if she doesn't die during the process. They didn't have to wait long before a blinding azure light shone brightly around the kitten, signaling the evolution of her soul. How could it happen so smoothly? One of the beast-eyed killer's followers exclaimed. She actually succeeded. And her aura is fluctuating as smoothly as if she hasn't been injured at all. Sava gulped. He had never heard of a person or beast who had forced a breakthrough like this and hadn't experienced some sort of backlash. Seems there is more than meets the eye with this thing. Her soul has to be quite robust to do this. The beast-eyed killer's easy attitude faltered. Internally, his brain got to work, crafting various theories on this mysterious beast before him that had just broken his initial impression of her as something that, while unique, was not worth much. Through his feelings of surprise, surged a powerful greed. This B*TCH may just be worth more than a little bit of coin after all. As the blinding azure light dissipated, the sight that befell everyone was that of a slightly changed Lexa. Instead of her small size that made her look like a 5-month-old kitten previously, now she had the likeness of a lithe, fully grown cat. Her already shimmering silver fur seemed to glow in a metallic gleam, like a beautiful piece of silver which reflected the sun, and her green and red eyes took on a stronger glow. Lexa studied her body for a few seconds with her unconscious eye and couldn't help but marvel at the great leap in improvement. Breaking through a rank had heightened her strength. She felt aura pulse through her like never before, and she can feel the strength of her muscles with every clench of them. Most noticeably, she noticed that her claws could extend to a particularly large length and seemed to also hold a metallic quality to them as well. It was then that suddenly, Lexa felt a massive surge of information attack her mind, filling her up with a knowledge of various origins. This knowledge was impossible to quantify and make heads and tails of in this impromptu moment. When it was finally all absorbed, Lexa found that this broad information had to be sifted through to sort out each piece of information. This would take a little bit of time. Time she didn't have at this moment. Chapter 79, Lexa's Charge. Quickly shaking off any external thoughts, Lexa didn't waste time as she charged forth towards the beast-eyed killer, eyes cloudy with anger. With a quick chant, a silver metallic form coalesced around her grown-up body. With her upgrade into the early stage of major rank, 90% of the Ravager armor was now made of pure metal, leaving only a measly sum left made up of the element of earth. Her defense had seen an incredible improvement, but that wasn't all. Unleashing a chantless celestial claw spell, the 4 white lines of magic that extended from her swinging claw was noticeably denser and visibly longer. The beast-eyed killer was rather surprised by the cat's speed, as in a matter of a few seconds, he was already being threatened by a rather impressive attack that exceeded the boundaries of her stage. But in the end, this was still an attack that could not measure up to someone of his level. Encasing the back of his left fist with a dense azure aura, the beast-eyed killer struck the incoming claw attack with the back of his fist. On contact, the 4 white claw lines seemed to crack and dissipate rapidly. He had disarmed the spell through a simple show of brute force. Lexa expected as much, and when she was getting rather close to this foe of hers, went to strike with another attack of the same like. The beast-eyed killer went to block this spell as well, only to find it was a feint as suddenly a spark of fire lit up right before his eyes, blinding him temporarily. While it would not blind him for long, it was good enough for Lexa's true mission, which was getting to Andrea. She could not feel safe until she had her partner by her side and out of the hands of these heinous villains. I'll have to thank Farhawk for that blinding technique. Lexa pondered internally. But on her way towards Andrea, Lexa's path was interrupted when pitch-black spikes erupted from the earth, descending towards her. Thankfully, with nimble steps, Lexa outmaneuvered those spikes and leapt back several feet to find that the source of this spell was the man she assumed to be only second to the big boss, the man they had called Sava. "Ha, you ain't going nowhere." Sava grinned maliciously before chanting a spell. Seconds later, he stretched out his 2 hands in front of himself and made it so that it looked like his fingers were gripping a long pole that wasn't there. Only, when his chant finished, a metallic dark material formed at the center of his 2 palms and stretched out to form a long, dark black spear with blades on each of its end. He seems to have some sort of insight into some sort of darkness element, maybe? Lexa could only guess as she watched in frustration as Sava sauntered over until he was directly in her path, blocking her path to Andrea. "You want to try at her, Sava?" The beast-eyed killer's voice sounded from behind her, and she turned to find the man with an unperturbed expression. It would seem being duped had not angered him much, as the end result seemed inevitable to him anyway. There was no way that the cat could successfully escape, so why get so worked up about a small blunder? "Leave it to me, she's pissing me off." Sava growled at her and the beast-eyed killer gave his agreement. "Just don't mess with her too much. There are debts to be settled with her and me." The beast-eyed killer chuckled before taking a step back. Lexa looked away from him reluctantly, not truly trusting his words before turning to face her apparent opponent. But she was not interested in dueling it out. All she wanted was to get past this B***starred and get to Andrea. Plus, she highly doubted she could defeat this man. Not only was he a whole rank ahead of her, but he also used magic she was completely unfamiliar with. When she was at the late stage of minor rank, she had defeated the steel-shelled turtle, which was either a mid-stage or late-stage beast, and had just barely beaten it. So she knew her natural talent in terms of her apprehension and ability was enough to defeat wild magical beasts of higher levels. But those were wild beasts which relied on their natural knowledge and abilities and didn't have the advantage of learning, inheriting and acquiring various goods like the opponent in front of her. Needless to say, her chances of succeeding were slim. What made everything worse was that Lexa could feel something made of aura encapsulating the area, which was most likely some sort of a barrier that encapsulated the entire area. This really made things seem hopeless. With a deep defeated sigh, Lexa's eyes flared open as she prepared to charge ahead. Even in the face of a seemingly hopeless situation, her stubbornness to prevail over any obstacle pushed her to fight. She still had so many things to do, and she wanted Andrea right next to her as her partner when she achieved them. Lexa let out a loud, bestial roar that would have echoed to great lengths if it weren't blocked by the barrier. But that didn't matter, as the target of this magically enforced roar was only the target in front of her, whose eager legs suddenly found themselves frozen under that fearsome roar. This was the power all magical beasts gained at the major rank, an ability called bestial fury. Choosing this perfect moment, Lexa leaped forth. Chapter 80, On the Escape. Lexa's most immediate obstacle while trying to get past this man called Sava was the Ghostwalker medallion, which could prevent her from chanting at a certain range. To get past this temporarily, Lexa noticed that the medallion had to be activated and wasn't on at all times. Thus, she quickly came up with the plan to use bestial fury to freeze the man's movements. Hopefully for long enough that she can dash past him and get to her partner. As Lexa's blurred form was dashing past him, Sava was delighted when he fought off the paralyzing effect of the bestial fury unleashed by that damn cat. His nimble limbs worked quickly, his left hand snapping in Lexa's direction, black shrouds encasing it. Lexa cursed her luck. While it was still impressive that her bestial fury worked on someone an entire rank above her, it was still not enough. There was nothing she could about it now, however, and these thoughts passed in the matter of a second. Bedor her brain quickly calculated her next move. In retaliation to the incoming grasping hand which was encased in a strange darkness, Lexa chose to face off Argarint the attack directly when she realized that his hands were moving faster than she could flee from its range. "You think you can escape the hands of a thief?" Sava taunted with a sinister grin marking his face. Lexa ignored his words and went on to chant a spell, only to find no voice being projected from her communicator. He had activated the Ghostwalker medallion and she was definitely in range to be affected. She didn't have the time to stress over this and had already expected this, so she quickly acted on her second option. So without delay, a ray of red light shot out of the bangle attached to her tail, the fifth and final scorching ray from her crimson iris bangle. As the scorching ray threatened to strike his hand which was encased by the dark substance, Sava visibly sneered. "Have you not learned your lesson from last time? Let me reflect your own spell back at you." But to his shock, this spell he recognized from before suddenly exploded into several red chunks that splattered across his body, doing no damage but dyeing parts of him a luminescent red, including painfully in his eyes as they squinted and blinked uncontrollably as he tried to free them of the red substance. Tehe, who would have thought that a little game of splat would actually be useful in battle? Lexa cheered internally as she looked on with glittering eyes. Lexa spared the reeling Sava no second thought for now and returned to her task at hand as she finally sprinted up to the prone Andrea, who looked on with an awed expression. She hadn't expected that Lexa could actually get past these scary adults, and she cried out in joy as she went in for a hug with her newly grown-up partner. "Lexa!" Andrea cried out as she hugged Lexa close to her heaving chest. Lexa felt pained with every teardrop she felt dripping onto her silver fur and hugged the girl in her hands with the best of her feline abilities. Being a cat, the hug was a little awkward. But she didn't think much of it and continued to hug her, trying to seep out all the fear and pain out of her partner so that she could share in it and make it easier for her. "We're going to be okay. We just need to break through this barrier and escape." Lexa tried to make her words sound as confident as she could so that she could build up the young girl's spirit. Andrea nodded amidst her tears, trying to sound just as confident. The two separated from their quick reunion and Lexa turned to look at their kidnappers, who hadn't moved in the slightest, except for Sava, who had begun to form water in his hands that he used to clean out the gunk in his eyes. He struggled, however, as Lexa had added a metallic quality to the magical substance that hardened it and made it difficult to remove. He only got rid of it after several seconds of serious scrubbing, and after it, the area around his eyes had swollen red like he had cried his heart out. Despite the seriousness of the situation she was in, Lexa couldn't hold back her laughter at the sight, and Andrea joined in between her crying. Sava growled at them furiously. How dare you? Sava spat through gritted teeth. Come on, we gotta go, Lexa exclaimed as she turned to look at a frightened Andrea, who stiffly nodded her agreement before the two took off, running towards the distance of the thistle forest. Lexa concentrated on finding where the barrier was and was preparing herself for her attempt at breaking through it. Lexa wasn't surprised to see Andrea lagging behind herself quite a bit and tried to match her speed. Behind them, Sava didn't bother to run after them, only walking at a steady pace as he prepped the dark spear in his hand in a throwing motion. His eyes concentrated on the two possible victims before narrowing on the easier target, the little girl. With his trademark nimbleness, the spear left his swung hand at great velocity, flying through the air like an arrow in Andrea's direction, threatening to pierce her through her back. However, Lexa acted swiftly, leaping and tackling Andrea so that she would avoid the spear's trajectory. Only, she was shocked when she found the spear changing its course, beckoning down on Andrea once again. Gritting her teeth, Lexa used a blast of wind to push her airborne self into the trajectory of the spear. She was going to take the attack head-on. Just before the spear crashed against her Ravager armor, Lexa activated another ability of the Crimson Iris, the Crimson Glaze spell. On activation, a red gleam shot out of the bangle on her tail before wrapping around her body entirely. When the dark black spear struck her chest area, the crimson glaze held strong for several moments before shattering into several sparks of red gleams. However, the barrier had done its job, so when the spear went on to strike her Ravager armor, the spear only managed to dig an inch or so into it before losing all momentum. The cracks formed around the wound quickly sealed up and pushed the spear out by the time Lexa landed safely on the mud beneath. Her armor had completely healed as if it had not received any damage. Meanwhile, the dark spear slowly dissipated into dark smoke, vanishing into the air. It could not continue to exist without being supplied aura. By the time the entire spear had vanished, so did the remnants of the Crimson Glaze spell that surrounded Lexa. Sava looked in anger at the series of events, not expecting the small creature to have such a strong defense. Wow! Andrea muttered with wide eyes. No time to awe at my godly abilities, let's go, Lexa exclaimed in a rush, though she didn't forget to praise herself during the process. Sava growled behind gritted teeth as he went to take a chase after the two, but was forcibly stopped when a gruff hand captured his shoulder. The intensity of that grab made him shudder and he wanted to cry out in pain but didn't dare as he immediately realized the man behind this motion. Useless. The beast-eyed killer spat before pulling the hand holding Sava's shoulder backwards roughly with a tighten grip. Sava repressed a scream as he was thrown ungraciously through the air and sent tumbling several meters on the ground. That fall didn't hurt him too terribly at his level, but the shame cut him deeply. He had hardly ever been on his boss' bad side, but he was too scared to shout any grievances and simply shot up to his feet as quickly as possible in a useless attempt to save himself some grace. The surrounding followers of the beast-eyed killer looked his way with eyes filled with laughter but dared not to vocalize their enjoyment of the other's enjoyment, lest they also get on their boss bad side as well. Let's see what little trick you come up with this time, the beast-eyed killer bellowed with a smile that did not reach his eyes forming on his scarred lips. He had no doubt that his employers were watching somewhere, waiting for the right time to pick the lass up after they had dealt her some abuse. So for Sava, his second-hand man to have been so disgracefully played like a fiddle at the hands of a 4-year-old and a magical beast only at the early stage of major rank, was extremely disgraceful for his image and made him uncontrollably angry. He did not like looking like a bloody fool. Chapter 81, Shatter. Lexa and Andrea didn't pay much attention to the ongoings behind them and continued their mad sprint to the barrier which was now just a few meters in front of them. The beast-eyed killer meanwhile was slowly walking towards the two and watched with glee as the two got closer to the barrier. Do they really think they can break through a barrier created by that man? Though I don't know the man's origins and I don't know much about runes, even I can tell that this man's rune work was far above his stage and rank, which seemed to be similar to my own. Lexa continued to charge at the barrier however, chanting a spell all the meanwhile. Andrea followed behind her closely, just running as fast as her little limbs let her. When Lexa's spell was activated, several metallic blobs started to form around the cat, nearly a dozen of them in total. They were all like a thick liquid as they began to stretch out and eventually hardened into the shape of long and thick bolts, ones you would expect to be used on a crossbow. This was the trademark signature of the second stage of the arrow-shattering sky arts, the duplication stage. This stage required its user to be at the early-mid stage of major rank, and though the ART's Echo Stone had held back most information about the stage's prospects, Lexa could garner a good imitation just from the stage's title alone. Sadly, she did not have the time to study the Echo Stone for now and could only attempt the magic with the little knowledge she had. This caused these magical bolts to consume more aura than she would like, but their strength should hopefully be more than worth it. So without hesitation, Lexa sent the flurry of bolts rocketing through the air, wind screeching in their wake as they headed off in the general direction of the barrier, whose form remained elusive. Boom! Lexa's blurry legs screeched to a halt and Andrea joined her as her feet skidded to a halt as well. No! Lexa's brow furrowed in despair. Not even a single scratch. Indeed, despite the massive explosive clash, despite the incredible strength and speed behind the bolts, the barrier remained undamaged. She had failed spectacularly. What now? Andrea mumbled, her cheeks reddened and puffy from all her crying as she looked deeply into her partner's eyes, searching for something. Anything. Kahaha. A burst of obnoxious laughter sounded behind the two, and Lexa begrudgingly looked over her tensed shoulder to see the boss of their kidnappers laughing hysterically. Now do you see how doomed you two truly are? What's your next move, eh? If you're done, then let me have my turn. As he chanted a spell, a dark form began to coalesce around the beast-eyed killer before forming around the entirety of his right arm, extending into a claw-like form, though its shape seemed fluid as it flowed like ribbons in the air. Let me show you the true strength of the depths of the dark arts. The beast-eyed killer growled through a bright grin that reached from ear to ear, twisting his scarred features into a menacing and terrifying sight. Feel the power of the holy element of darkness. Without further ado, the beast-eyed killer charged forth, the wavy dark claw becoming restless and chaotic as it followed. With a giant leap, the beast-eyed killer's amazing speed brought him upon the cat in a flash. Lexa took a second to process the previous sequence before her pupils darted to her attacker's new position, shocked at his speed. She wasn't even able to see a single movement in between. This horrified her. Seeing that he was coming for her, Lexa chose to be cautious and sent a gust of wind that pushed Andrea out of harm's way while simultaneously activating the second spell of her Crimson Iris Bangle, the Crimson Glaze. The limitations of the Crimson Glaze spell was not as stringent as its offensive counterpart, as it could be activated at any time. Its shortcomings were that it only activated for the shortest of moments, and required around a minute of time before it could be activated once more. The beast-eyed killer's dark claw came streaking down with a voracious cry, striking the red glaze that shrouded Lexa's full form. Unfortunately, the barrier could only hold a moment before it shattered at the claw's great strength. Red dust glistened and scattered as it dissipated. Lexa's eyes closed, embracing her defeat. It didn't take long before she was forced to let out a shrill cry as she was slammed against the hard floor. She was unable to avoid the claw's might. The attack coming too fast and the sheer size of the claw aided in its trap. Lexa winced as she was held prisoner under the dark claw. It held most of her body, feeling brittle under the claw's weight, only leaving her head poking out. One could feel Lexa's pain in every struggled breath and hoarse cry that escaped her lungs. Lexa, no. Andrea cried out as she landed from being thrown earlier. She was on her bottom as one of her hands hovered over her shaking mouth, looking on in horror at the scene in front of her. Her horror quickly changed into one of anger though. Let her go, you bully. Andrea screamed and quickly went into chanting some sort of spell as she looked on with deep hatred at her partner's capturer. The beast-eyed killer tilted an eyebrow, finding her actions rather futile and humorous. What has the little noble girl got? What *TTY magic did your precious daddy teach you, huh? Don't make fun of daddy, Andrea screamed out upon completion of her spell, which shockingly seemed to unleash no effect to the confusion of the beast-eyed killer and his followers. This was until the beast-eyed killer suddenly felt the pressure beneath his dark claws give way suddenly, almost tripping him up. This be *TCH. The beast-eyed killer growled with wide eyes. Lexa was also just as shocked when she found the earth beneath her give way, sinking down and creating a small crater under her. She automatically understood her partner's plan and didn't dare waste this precious chance. Drawing out aura to her greatest opacity, Lexa enforced her 4 limbs, empowering them to her limit. At the same time, she used the element of wind to lessen any wind resistance. Using all means available to her, Lexa darted as quick as she could before those dark claws could grasp her once again. Having been blindsided by this maneuver, the beast-eyed killer's reaction was delayed, actually allowing Lexa to escape the claw's grasp when he finally swiped its great length at her in an attempt to grab hold of her smaller form. "No, you bloody don't." The beast-eyed killer was furious with rage. Even if in his eyes, these 2 brats could never escape no matter how many times they slipped from their grasp, each time it did happen was a slap in the face that added on to the shame. How could he demand people's respect when he couldn't even hold a damn magical beast at the major rank prisoner? A mere beast 2 whole ranks below him, he couldn't let her escape. "Don't underestimate me, B*TCH. The beast-eyed killer's voice was becoming rather shrill and maddening in its pitch at this point as his jagged eyes became bloodshot in the intensity of his sheer anger. With a great thrust of his right hand, the black claw extended to a great length and morphed shape. Nobody escapes the abyssal snake spell. In conjunction with his screaming words, the black, coalescing darkness that had taken the form of a 5-fingered claw twisted cruelly into the shape of a massive snake that extended like a rope as it chased the retreating form of the fleeing cat. "No!" Andrea cried as the dark snake bared down on Lexa, its arrival seeming inevitable. Except, it was at this moment that a roaring, reverberating crashing sound resounded loudly, demanding the attention of everyone. "How dare you!" The beast-eyed killer's eyes turned into saucers as he suddenly felt a great pressure grasp his shaggy head. The pressure was so unbearable that he couldn't hold back the visceral scream that escaped his lungs at that moment. His jagged eyes scrunched up and blood began to leak from his nose. At first, it was but a drip, but quickly it was pouring, not only from his nose but from every other orifice in his head as well. His shrill and croaky scream only croaked to a stop when his limbs became limp and the color in his jagged eyes dimmed. Seconds later, his large corpse was dropped unceremoniously onto the gritty earth below. The beast-eyed killer had died just like that. All of the beast-eyed killer's follower looked on in shock as a deep-rooted feeling of despair bloomed, even more so when the person behind this savage maneuver was revealed in front of them. Lexa tripped in her hasty retreat, unaware of all this until she had looked back from the ground, still expecting her incoming doom. Only, her eyes opened in shock at the scene before her as her countenance turned into one of great relief, a feeling of relief stronger than she had ever felt prior. Behind her, Andrea's eyes assumed the same expression, even more so than Lexa. Tears sprayed with her shaking head as she let out a large shout filled with grievance, relief, and affection. "Daddy, don't worry, little un, Daddy's here now." Alexander gave her a comforting smile as he stepped beyond the now broken confines of the elusive barrier. Chapter 82, Ruby Enchantress. Several minutes prior to Alexander's arrival. Back in the camp, the head of Alexander's soldiers, a sturdy man at the late stage of spirit rank, had been on his night watch duty for a few hours at this point. The cold wind of night brushing against his reddening cheeks. Taking a big yawn, he freezes midway when a sudden feeling of unease takes over him. Something feels off. Looking into the darkness of the thistle forest, however, he sees nothing of note beyond a few harmless animals resting and crawling in the night. Seeing nothing with his normal sight, he decides to enhance his vision by using the technique one comes to gain at the spirit rank, the conscious eye. With this enhanced vision, however, he still finds no signs of intruders in a mile radius around him. Nearly thinking he was worrying for nothing, he suddenly thinks of another possibility for this uneasy feeling bubbling up inside him and turns his vision towards the camp itself. He sees no intruders thankfully and is just about to finally give up when he notices something shocking in his peripheral vision. There is no aura in his young miss tent. A deep feeling of shock and despair rushes over him, a frigid cold burning up in his chest colder than the night's shiver-inducing breeze. His eyes are wide as his pupils dash left and right madly, searching for any semblance of the young miss, and her newly gained partner, the kitten, for that matter. But to his utter dismay, He cannot find them anywhere, and a surge of worry, anger, and despair overtakes him at that moment. But having been in this business for most of his life and having a strong soul at his level, he doesn't allow himself to be overcome too long before his worn brown boots are dashing towards the largest and most grand tent in the encampment. "Sir Wilderwolf!" The man shouts, a scream filled with anguish and haste. It's an emergency. Seconds later, a hand reaches out from the entrance of the tent and pulls apart the opening of the tent, revealing Alexander as he walks out the tent with narrowed eyes. His hair is a mess, obviously having been just woke up, and his eyes are slightly hunched despite his best efforts to appear alert. "Do we have intruders?" Alexander inquired, his eyes darting about the encampment, but seeing nothing obviously wrong, he turned to look at the head of the Wilderwolf soldiers dubiously. "Sir, Andrea is missing." His voice came out croaky and anxious, but yet hauntingly clear in the ears of Alexander. Upon hearing those words, Alexander's face pales instantly and his hazy eyes widen as a turbulent emotion surges inside. His fists were held so tight his nails were digging into his palm. If his mortal body weren't so tough, his nails would definitely have pierced deep into the skin, drawing blood. "What?" Alexander finally exclaimed with bloodshot eyes. The man opposite winced but didn't dare tarry as he explained all that he knew. Alexander used his own search using his own conscious eye and studied the area in a several-mile radius, but also came up with nothing to his utter devastation. "All right. Wake up everyone and have them prepare. I'll find them," Alexander ordered the soldier, with the soldier running off without delay to follow them. Alexander meanwhile fished his hand into the collar of his shirt before he pulled out a chain necklace that held a particularly beautiful platinum rose jewel hanging delicately. At the center of the rose, a red jewel was shaped into the intricate form of an eye, looking both beautiful and enchanting. How did these intruders get past my ruby enchantress? I know my senses weaken greatly when I sleep, but I should have been able to detect someone at least at the spirit rank or below still with the added benefits of this necklace. Was it a sky magician or beast? Or maybe, a magical item? Either way, these B******stards are not simple. My dear little Anne. These thoughts came to Alexander like turbulent waves, one after the other until he finally shook his head of all unnecessary and unwanted thoughts. I only have one choice. It may use up its dose for this month, but if there's ever a time to use it, it is now when my beloved daughter is desperately waiting for me. Hands clenched shakily around the ruby enchantress necklace, Alexander gritted his teeth and directed a surge of his own aura into the magical item until it began to glow brighter and brighter of a deep azure color. Suddenly, everything around Alexander seemed to pause in time, though that was just at initial glance. If Alexander concentrated hard enough for a long while in this state, he would notice that everything wasn't actually still as if frozen in time, but actually everything was just moving hundreds of times slower than their natural state. Like when a magician of the spirit rank and above used the ability of the conscious eye, Alexander could see the aura of everything around him, that of every person and magical item in sight. This also included every single rising earth thistle flower that made up this grand thistle forest. Without the use of the ruby enchantress, Alexander's vision would not be nearly as advanced as it was in this moment, as not only did the item help to increase his range of sight but also advanced the precision of his sight. Where the rising earth thistles would have blurred slightly in his sight previously as he gazed off into the distance, they were now as clear as if they were right in front of him. With this sight, it wasn't long before he noticed an anomaly a few miles from the encampment. A barrier. Alexander's eyes narrowed and he increased his concentration into peering deeper through the barrier, which fought with tooth and nails to keep him from seeing beyond its confines. This barrier is extremely well made. Almost at the level of a sky magician. But it still falls short to my ruby enchantress. In conjunction with those thoughts, his sight broke through the restraints of the barrier and he peered intently inside, only to have his eyes bulge in horror at the sight before him. His sight didn't stay on the area long as his eyes closed in pain. Tears threatened, but he held them back. He had no time to let his emotions get the better of him. At this time, several Wilderwolf soldiers had begun to gather behind him. All of their eyes held a dark gleam as they waited at the ready, bulky fingers grasping their weapons with intensity. They would do anything to save their precious young miss. "What are your orders, Lord Wilderwolf?" The head of the wilder wolf soldiers returned to his side, his face looked stoic and his hand rested on his sheathed blade, but one could tell from his intense, narrowed eyes that his anger didn't fail to match the best of them. Alexander had just closed his eyes seconds before this inquiry and seemed to not hear his words until his eyes shot open and with one, bellowing step, he was flashing off into the distance, his form quickly shrouded in the darkness of the forest. "Follow." Alexander's growling voice echoed back to them with a fiery intensity, passing his simple but apt orders. They noticed in the wake of their lord's path, a line of ice forming a long path into the horizon, and they knew immediately to follow this path to follow their lord on their mission. Follow the lord. Elsewhere in the Thistle Forest, neither in the wilder wolf encampment or in the beast-eyed killer's hideout, but instead about a mile off from there, atop the leaf of a rising earth thistle was the familiar form of a tall, lanky man. H was the same man who had erected the barrier around the beast-eyed killer's hideout and lent them the Ghostwalker medallion. Beside him was his usual companion, the man who had initially met up with the beast-eyed killer all the way back in Skyview City. The lanky man's attention, which had been solely watching the beast-eyed killer and his men as they roughed up their target, suddenly darted in another direction as he felt a great surge of aura flashing through the forest. How did he see past my barrier? The lanky man's eyes opened in surprise before returning to normalcy, seemingly not to be too affected by this fact beyond his initial surprise. "It would seem the plan has been compromised," the other man by his side muttered. The lanky man didn't bother to respond as he watched intently at the blurred form of Alexander. He arrived at the location of his barrier and broke through it with an intensity that didn't hold back in his anger and watched with no emotion as his fingers grabbed their employee with an iron grip, quickly sucking him of his life. "It seems we have really riled them up this time, hey?" The lanky man's eerie laugh was shiver-inducing as he watched on with strange interest. "You've caught up with Reincarnated Cat Becomes a Magical Beast. Congratulations! You've reached the latest chapter of Reincarnated Cat Becomes a Magical Beast. Stay tuned for the next thrilling update as the story continues. Don't forget to check back soon for new chapters. In the meantime, explore our full collection of novels or visit the main page of Reincarnated Cat Becomes a Magical Beast and leave a review.